I am delighted to welcome Dr. Arpitha Kodiveri, my dear friend from the Young India Fellowship, who's published a new book. Today, I want to talk to her about her career, her mental models for taking strategic decisions, and essentially why she wrote this book. So, Arpitha, tell us a bit about what prompted you to embark upon this adventure of writing a book.
Such a great question. I actually never started the process thinking I would write a book. A lot of it began after law school when I started working with Adivasi communities on issues around forest rights, around land rights, and broader questions of environment versus development kind
Mm.
of conflicts. And I started to maintain what was then like a very rudimentary diary of sorts, where I was kind of making notes of what the law was doing, what the law was not doing, and how it was failing, and my role as a lawyer in those conflicts. Um, to then eventually getting my master's and my PhD from the European University Institute, where I was able to look at all of that as not just field notes, but like data to kind of bring together what is a rich story of what's happening with Adivasi communities who are engaging with the law on their legal struggles. So then the book made a lot of sense. And I think you're in the throes of starting your PhD. So eventually, one of the goals with the thesis is always like you want it to not just, sit in a shelf, you want it to be out in the world. And so that was another motivating factor to write this book.
Um, I know you've been working with Adivasis for a while, but many of our listeners are actually not from India. So, do you want to tell us a bit about who we are referring to and what specifically do you talk about in the book?
Absolutely. Um, so Adivasi is literally translates to the original inhabitants. And these are communities who've lived and depended on India's forests for generations. Very often, the threats that they've encountered is that the colonial legal structures of forest governance have basically directed a lot of power and decision making in the hands of the state to the extent where these communities were displaced in order to conserve these areas. Then we also have the sort of threat that they encountered with the entrance of extractive companies wanting to mine those lands, right? It's
Mm.
literally a sandwich problem where you have communities, you have the forests, and then you have the mines. And so my work was essentially as a lawyer supporting these communities to implement a law called the Forest Rights Act, which sought to kind of recognize the rights of these communities to their lands and waters. And so when I'm talking about the work I do with Adivasi communities and who they are, these are the communities I'm referring to. And the communities I had the privilege of working with were mostly in the eastern Indian state of Orissa and Rajasthan, as well as Gujarat, which are in the western side. Yeah.
Would it be safe for people to think of them as Indians in the American part of the world, or are there differences? Native Indians.
Native Indians. I think that is a fair comparison. So the only complication is in the Indian context, we don't use the term indigenous peoples,
Hmm.
only because the history of citizenship in India is so complicated with multiple migrations and invasions, that the Adivasi story gets kind of lost through the cracks because in some ways they are the indigenous peoples. But if we start to use that terminology, then we might pit one community against the other in terms of who's the original Indian in that sense.
When I glanced through the book, I did get a sense that the book is also a book about many cities. So I've seen you in Bangalore, Delhi, of course, New York, and Florence, maybe a few other cities. How have these cities contributed to the book, directly or indirectly?
I think each city has contributed uniquely to the writing of this book. Bangalore, because that's home. And so during COVID, actually, I couldn't be in Florence where I was supposed to be for my PhD. And so I had to end up writing a bulk of the book while being at home. And it was interesting to be in Bangalore during that time specifically because you're seeing sort of the world around you kind of change, right, rapidly during the pandemic, and you need something to ground you. And so Bangalore was that grounding force for me. But politically, also, Bangalore was where I started to explore what it might mean to be an activist lawyer. And so being connected to those spaces was very important in terms of how I wrote the book. Um, in terms of Florence, I honestly credit Florence for its aesthetic pleasantness. That's like such a quaint way to describe it, but it's almost like you're living in a museum of sorts. So those cafes and the food were just, it got me to write the book in a setting that was just so indulgent. And so I would never take that away from Florence. It gave me the time to really reflect away from the pressures of activism or being politically sort of involved. Um, and I'll quickly sort of speak to New York and Delhi. New York, I think, was interesting because it was where I was after the pandemic. So the PhD had already happened, and I was in the sort of phase of converting it into a book. And we met in New York as well. And a lot of
At
the
Independent Cafe, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, exactly. Um, I think New York was fascinating in terms of a place to write the book, not just because of the energy, but the kinds of conversations I was able to have. So I used to go to this cafe called the Book Club in the East Village, where I'd end up writing through the day and end up meeting strangers who are working on their own books or just engaged generally. And those conversations in some way gives you a very inspiring setting to really work on like your own thoughts and like your own work. Delhi, I credit Delhi a lot actually for this book, only because of the Young India Fellowship, right? I think Bangalore is interesting in the sense that people are out there being politically active, but I find that in Delhi, there's like a way in which people intellectualize and think about the world that really opened up new doors for me. And I think that was both a product of being at YF and having classes like sociology of the environment or philosophy or any of those kinds of bigger questions. But also, everybody else was equally able to use those kinds of lenses to have those conversations with you. And that, I think, to me, even gave me the sort of courage to be like, okay, maybe I can think of this as a career and maybe I could write a book someday.
Tell us
So,
about your main problem statement that you wanted
mm,
to address through the book and your main argument. And then we'll go on to discussing the structure, the
mm.
subcontext, and so forth.
Yeah. So the main problem statement that the book sort of tries to address is twofold. The first part of the problem is we're sort of surrounded by the climate crisis. But interestingly, despite being surrounded by the climate crisis and all the science giving us a lot of information about planetary boundaries, we have laws which are being either violated or deregulated. So, how do we then look at the indigenous story in that light, right? Because these are communities who continue to want to defend their lands and waters. Where is that a story of inspiration and sort of the future of lawmaking? Or is it something that we continue to sort of criticize as being anti-development? When all along they've been telling us you need to repair your relationship with the planet. That's the only way you can survive. So that's the first part of the problem statement. The second part is what can we learn then from these indigenous struggles? What can because you can reject them all you want, but there is a lot of wisdom and a lot of creative ideas coming from there.
Hmm.
So, what would it mean to actually listen and to yield to those ideas? What would the world and the future of law look like? So, the book tries to deal with both of those aspects.
And I think they are so multi-layered. We could, perhaps when we meet in the UK, we can have a part two of this. But the first one is the essential idea of capitalism and globalization in the 21st century, right? Um, Progress. the word
Mm,
progress for who, what happens, should it be a maximalist argument, should it be based on um, the economic value of a new factory in the next 5 years versus the rights of, say, 2,000 people
mm,
living there. It's a
mm.
very real debate. And
Yeah.
then with the climate crisis, everyone is talking about it. There are many forums about it, and those forums are often sponsored by companies that may have a challenge with this or may want to mine it. And that, again, is a fascinating problem to go after. And even the second part of the way you structure it, potential ways and lessons that we can take from these movements, so to speak.
Mm,
Many of them are are being looked at with some amount of skepticism by well-meaning people as well. And I'd love to hear your point of view of why that is. So first of all, congratulations for laying it out so clearly and trying to address such an important problem. I won't ask you what your solution is, a three-pointer. Tell me how you structured the book and why.
mm. So the way I've structured the book is very so one of the best kinds of pieces of advice I got from a professor who used to teach at Oxford, actually, Professor Tarunab Ketan, when I was trying to write a paper, he was like, be kind to your reader, you know,
Hmm,
make sure that your reader is not having to do a lot of work. And that doesn't mean you're dumbing down what you're saying, but that you're able to have the reader walk with you through the book, right? That's the eventual goal. And so the structure was kind of keeping in mind that I have a reader who's probably never encountered this context, someone who's very new to the way the law operates and what happens. So the structure is sort of determined by that goal to make it as accessible as possible. And the second is also to sort of adhere to the narrative arc that I was trying to kind of communicate, which was again, kind of looking at the law by design is not perfect. These are the issues. The science and the problem and the scale of it is really large. We can go into the doomsday scrolling and doomsday prophesizing, but what if we operate from the ideas of hope and repair? So, what do the
hmm,
communities on the ground actually do? So, the
hmm.
first part of the book kind of details out the history and the sort of legal context for these conflicts, and
Yeah.
it focuses on like the forests. Uh, the second part sort of looks at how our indigenous communities or Adivasi communities being cornered by the law and capitalism, but how do they still manage to shape the law with this aspiration of repairing the relationship with nature? So that's kind of the three-part structure.
Got it. And when you talk about what we can, like how we define the problem, the challenges with capitalism, you've straddled many aspects of it. One as a lawyer, as an activist, now as an academic. How have you tried to combine all of these lenses in the first part of your book?
Mm. Um, so I think so here's the thing, right? Like one way to think about it is in a very adversarial way. To think of these struggles as always being anti-capitalist or anti-development or anti-progress. But once you go on the ground, you realize it's more sophisticated than that adversarial positioning. What you end up seeing is people just trying to make a livelihood on an everyday basis. It is about economic justice. It is about socioeconomic rights. It's about how do we design our economic systems not to constantly marginalize those who are marginalized. And so the way I try to communicate a lot of that in the first part of the book is sort of talk about those everyday stories. So, talk about, for example, a struggle in an area where you have an Adivasi community protesting for the mine to start,
Mm,
right? It's a very strange idea. Why would an indigenous community want a plant to be set up or a mine to be opened up? But that's because this is a community already lost their lands under the promise that this factory would be set up, and the factory wasn't set up. So it's an
mm,
issue of economic justice. And so I try to move away from a very sort of as an activist, I used to be more, pick more sides and pick more battles. But I think as an academic, I've evolved to sort of saying, okay, this is what's happening on the ground,
mm.
and let's use that as the basis to talk about these issues.
And I think it's so important because it seems to me, when I went through your book that you don't frame it as a binary, that this worldview versus the other. And personally, and these are some of the discussions that we used to have back in class or after class as well, the more obvious answer seems to be that, hey, if a factory comes up or if some version of modernity comes to that place, there'll be jobs. The GDP of that particular area could increase. There could
Yeah.
be modern medicine, technology, and all of these things can potentially make living good there. And to the uninitiated, this seems like a fair argument. It seems that why would you not do it? Why would you leave people who've been, for whatever reason, chosen to or been left behind by technological progress? Why would you leave them behind? But I think you make a compelling case that it's uh, one has to be careful about imposing one's worldview onto
Hmm.
another, and I think you do that really well. Um, what are the kind of pushbacks have you gotten over the years, and how have you? What's your argument been against them?
Pushback that I've gotten over the years is very often there is the argument that you're preventing or you're romanticizing the worldview of these communities in order to serve your environmentalist agenda,
Are
right?
you?
I don't think so. I used to. I think in the starting early days, I would confess that that was in some ways my strategy, right?
Hmm.
If the idea is to protect that hill, and there are communities depending on that pristine
Hmm.
forest, then why not bring both of those causes together? But I think over the years, I've started to, I wouldn't say like respond to this pushback, but really take it on board and actually kind of understand that indigeneity is such a complicated subject, right?
Hmm.
Like I had a Adivasi friend saying, am I Adivasi only if I'm in the forest? What happens to me once I leave the forest? Right? Am I
What
less
happens to
Adivasi
them?
now?
Tell me.
I think that I think it's a story of them having more agency to decide on what their futures look like. I think
Hmm.
for me right now that's where I'm at.
Hmm.
I'm not going to impose my agenda onto your futures, right? So how do we create an environment where a Adivasi youth growing up can in some ways not be forced to make that choice. If I stay in the forest, I get land rights. If I leave, then the capitalist system is going to eat me alive. What does it mean for them to be able to make those choices, as Arjun Appadurai argues, like the capacity to aspire is protected, the capacity to have a wide spectrum of choices. Like as a youth in Bangalore from a higher caste family,
Hmm.
choices were endless, right? Of course,
Hmm.
as women, we faced a lot of restrictions and this and that. But as an Adivasi, what are your choices? How much freedom do you have to make those choices? And that for me is more central a question now than it was when I started.
Fascinating. Let's go deep. What are the choices? So, say for Adivasi youth, it seems to a common person uh,
Mm,
that they are living in that particular piece of land out of their own will, or they are being forced. I don't think that's the common perception, but
mhm,
let's say they are there and they're missing out on all these technological and social progress that has happened outside. And plus, they're sitting on top of so many minerals, resources, which is part of, let's say, a country.
mm,
So shouldn't people in the country have a right to some of those benefits?
yeah.
And people look at it when it suits them, that what's the return on investment on a land which is of quote unquote their
Right.
country or their state.
Mhm,
And when it's and the other side of it would be, okay, you only think of Adivasis when you want to extract something, not necessarily
yeah.
when you want to, work with them or engage with them truly. And then
Right.
the debate, because how do you really engage with people you don't understand? And to
Mm,
demystify this, people like you write the book and help us understand the argument. So I think
yeah.
success for this particular podcast focused on your career and your book would be if you can help our listeners in India and abroad really get the essence of why they should care about the problem.
Okay, so let's like reframe that a little bit, right? So you have a situation globally, and this is not just the India story, where you have communities who are dependent on certain lands, and there's a sacred bond or a sacred commitment that they have. And if you were to put it in legal terms, it's like a sacred contract.
Mm,
Then you have colonial legal structures which say your sacred contract is well and good, but it's only to the level of the surface. What is underneath belongs to the state.
mm,
So it's a quite a strange situation. You have that. And then you have the big question of Adivasi youth or indigenous youth and the choices they have, whether they can engage with the market system on their own terms or not. That's another set of questions we can talk about. But amidst all this, now you have everybody saying that if we don't conserve our forests, we don't know if we're going to meet that 1.5 degrees Celsius
mm,
threshold,
mm.
right? So there's now a different kind of
Part of the
pressure.
global agenda, the macro
Exactly,
agenda that
global
everyone's
agenda.
talking about. Yeah.
Everyone's talking about. It's like Alpa Shah talks about in her book, which is the eco-incarceration. Like we will stunt these communities if they can serve as the benevolent stewards of these lands in order for us to reach that 1.5 degrees Celsius. So again, you're kind of curtailing them in different ways. So if we were to reframe the problem in those terms, if these are communities who are on the front lines of both having the worst impacts of climate change, but also being the bearers of the solutions for the climate problem, then we have to kind of not just care, but really listen,
Mm,
really sit down and take complete cognizance of that situation. Because it might seem like the indigenous story is just something that can be dealt with or managed, but rather it is the story that's going to determine our collective ecological futures. Um, because these are communities who manage to not just conserve these areas, but respect the thresholds of ecosystems.
mm,
We don't know how to do that. The capitalist system, and I don't think many of your listeners or you would agree, but I do think we're at the end times of capitalism, only because ecological thresholds are not going to hold those systems in place. We're reaching a stage of complete excesses, right? There was a recent lawsuit by the state of California against Exxon because Exxon had mentioned that they recycle plastics, but turns out they only recycle 8%. And so, where does the rest of it go? And how does that come back into our bodies? So I think if we listen to indigenous communities, what we may be able to, or if we think of indigenous futurism as a way of framing it, what they may be able to assist us is to do that course correction. Because right
mm.
now we don't know how to do it, legally or non-legally.
Yeah. Look, your point on capitalism or any point in general, whether somebody agrees with it or not, but it's an important point of view. And we've always tried to build network capital as a place where all ideas can thrive. So if you feel like going deeper into the case for or against capitalism, please feel free,
Mhm.
because I think that's how conversation moves forward. And the argument that you've made is a fairly compelling one. Right now, leaders are meeting in New York to discuss primarily climate change,
Yeah.
right? And for that, temperature will come up. For that, forests will be part of that discussion. But I'm not sure if Adivasis have been invited or would they like to be
Exactly.
invited. And yeah, that's a viable case. But the people who sit on the other side, I think you get where they're coming from, right?
Mhm.
They want the uh, at least some benefit to go to the countries, communities, families they're
Mhm.
part of, and they also for either lack of awareness or perhaps good intention believe that they can quote unquote uplift the people who are
Mm.
there.
Mm.
And
Right.
it's not an argument which can just seep in, and then
Mm.
you have people say that activists and academics to further their agenda or their academic theory want to almost preserve these
Mm.
Adivasis in their
Mm.
existing conditions. And I'd love to see whether you've experienced these kind of pushback in your writing, and how have you tackle that in your book?
Mm. No, I've definitely, I mean, that's a reality, right? It's about the resources aren't required, especially if you go to the issue of coal mining, because it
Mm.
then becomes an issue of energy security.
Yeah,
So if you're protesting against a coal mine, then you're pitting, the development and access to energy of one group of citizens against another.
yeah.
And why are we, treating one set of citizens differently than the other? Um, and similar pushback in terms of also from the Adivasi, forget about like external voices, but like within Adivasi communities itself. So when I was doing fieldwork in Talabira in Orissa, you had a lot of educated Adivasi youth who were excited that Adani was setting up a coal mine there on the grounds that many of them had studied and wanted proper jobs. They didn't want to move to the city for these jobs. And so there is this narrative also that, by you don't think that the community is fully cohesive in that sense on this agenda of protecting forests. It is
Hmm.
divided. And so the way I've dealt with that question in my book is I have told those stories. I have told the stories of how communities have used the law to protect their land, but also how have communities used the law to arrive at better agreements with mining companies for selling their land. And they're both equally true.
And it's so fascinating, and I would say intellectually rigorous and honest. You want to portray which social group is homogeneous, they believe everything uh, exactly the same, and they have all beliefs, all ideas. There's no room for debate. No, no social group is like that. Thank you for capturing it. The Adani one did surprise me, because I've read a
Mm.
little bit about the group that seems to be doing really well financially. That does seem to have interests in regions like forests. What prompted them to not move forward? I'm pretty sure that the reason could not just be sudden environmental awareness.
Mm. Yeah, usually it's so the reality of these protests also, again, going with the theme of being very honest about what happens on the ground, is they start to become politically charged. So you have
Mm,
multiple other kinds of interests that come into play. So
mm,
whether it is political parties or activists, um, and again, not to sort of derail, like you mentioned, all of these ideas are valid. So they come and they sort of work with the communities to mobilize them. And so once they mobilize and they create some kind of cohesive story there,
mm,
there tends to be this idea that this is not going to make sense anymore.
mm,
Um, and I think the story that I have really tried to listen to amidst all of this, I don't want to call it noise, but for me, it somewhat is a lot of
mhm.
noise that exists, is how do Adivasi communities envision their own futures and how much agency and control do they have to set out that future constellation of stars that they want to follow,
Yeah.
right? And so, amidst all of this, I think that the Adivasi story is more complicated than it's made out to be.
It seems like they do want multiple futures. They do
Mm,
want more agency, which is what I think people in general want. I want more agency. I want different futures or access to different things. Um, but it is a bit more complex, and I think you do a really good job of putting it in your book. Are there examples in India or abroad where there has been a fair compensation, financial or otherwise, of people who are on the land? Where at one level, it can also be a fairly straightforward transaction. I am
mm,
sitting on top of, say, X dollars worth of land or
exactly.
resources. Um, I'm happy to move. I think I should be compensated ABC, and that compensation is done. People have moved willingly. Are there
Mm.
examples of that? Does that happen, or this is just la la land?
So I think that is, I'm so glad you asked me that question because that kind of comes to the other part of this question, right? Because yes, they want to protect their land, but in certain instances, they also want to be able to sell their land on a very fair basis.
Mm,
but that doesn't really happen. Usually what happens is they get
Any
compensated.
generally, this is not the norm. You want to
This
typically,
isn't.
okay.
No, as in it is the norm, but it's not the norm to be fairly compensated. It's the
Hmm,
norm to be compensated in a very ad hoc fashion. There's also a tendency of like middlemen who come in and broker these agreements across the company and for the community. There's a
right.
lot that goes on in terms of that, those transactions. But examples exist not in the context of communities being compensated when they're displaced from their land, but when there has been a huge environmental crisis
Hmm,
or harm has happened. So, for example, when there was an oil spill in the Niger Delta, the indigenous community took Shell to court and they were able to be compensated for it. But it hasn't happened in the land context. I know there's one case in Kenya, it doesn't come to mind right now. But in the Indian context, not really. And that's where I find that a lot of work has to happen.
yeah.
Because if we are going to mine these lands, we can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, generally speaking, if anyone has a precious resource, he or she or they would want to sell it at a premium. And
Exactly.
typically, it's a negotiation with the owner and the purchaser, and a middle ground is reached. This typically happens if there are very clear digital records of
Mm.
assets and prices and a
Mm.
fair understanding of what's acceptable. I would imagine that in the case of tribals, that may not be the case, or Adivasis, that may not be the
Mm.
case. Digital records or any kind of records may not be present. So, how does it work
Mm.
actually, and at what scale or space do you think change should happen going
Mm.
forward?
Right. So just in terms of like the point that you made around evidence and the lack of it in terms of like resources, all of that, it's
Is
more
that a
of
fair
a
concern? I'm just asking
it is a
because,
fair concern. It
okay.
is a fair concern. It is a fair concern, but it's also interesting in terms of who has access to this evidence and who doesn't.
Hmm,
So the state ministries, especially when they conduct geological surveys and companies who do prospecting licenses for minerals, they do have all the data, but it's never really shared with the community. So the community, in like my book, I talk about how one of the communities just woke up one morning and a land survey was happening, and they
hmm.
didn't know why. And then they found out that it's because there are certain kinds of minerals, and a
Of
prospecting
course, yeah.
license was permitted. So I think for me, it's about how do we. I think a lot of it has to do with questions of democracy. How do we
Hmm,
share information and how do we make decisions in a way that those who are most impacted by it have a say in the process.
hmm. Oh, that makes sense. You would have seen these movements happen in different parts of the world. Is there something that connects all these movements? And second, is there something really unique happening in Indian movements?
There's definitely something that connects all these movements. I think the stories of injustice, the historical injustice that communities, especially indigenous communities, have faced is very common across these jurisdictions. But I think what's unique about the Indian story is how the Constitution has actually accommodated this question of Adivasi sovereignty and how communities have often used the law as their tool of resistance.
Hmm,
I've kind of seen it. Again, I don't claim to be a scholar of either Australia or the United States, but I have seen examples of it here.
hmm,
But it's just so much stronger in the Indian context. Just to share with the listeners, there's a movement called the Patalgadi movement, where communities are placing these stones with provisions from the constitution and other laws which
hmm,
recognize Adivasi sovereignty as a reminder to the state
hmm,
as they come into these spaces, saying these are the terms of engagement, right? And so there's something very, very amazing about that. I think of Adivasi movements in India as being creative legal strategists, really, and as legal thinkers. Um,
Love this perspective. When did things start to go awry? Because now things have obviously not been the way you imagined for a while. What could have been done at the start to nip the problem in the bud? Or
mm.
if you could just give us a bit of a history tour to understand this.
I think that one thing I must confess is there have been genuine attempts to repair the situation. So whether it was the making of the Indian Constitution or trying to decolonize forest laws, I think in terms of a pivot of where history could have changed, if I were to just go into a time machine and change it,
Mm,
um, I think it would have been more important for us to weigh what the Constitution had promised
mm,
against a lot of the laws that were seeking to extract from these areas.
mm,
What would it happen if we gave both those legal arguments equal weight and
mm.
not constantly move in the direction of, the imperative to extract? And that's a political economy question. I get it. Again, I'm not here to say that we all have to have anti-extractive perspectives on the
Mm.
economy, but it's about degrees and process. How do we arrive at these decisions through sheer negotiation? What is the
Yeah.
least harm that could have happened?
And I think that's fair because sometimes the anti-extraction folks, policymakers, are accused of trying to make it impossible for anything to move, make laws that are so complicated that you cannot possibly try and help people like that. That's at least what I've read. You're the insider. You can tell us. But this is at least the first half of our discussion is really hopefully helped our listeners and viewers get a sense of what the problem is, why they should care, why it's an interesting discussion that involves markets, people, and morality. Now let's move to the lessons because we'd like to get deep into that. What can we learn from these protests? This Patthar thing that you talked about is fascinating. First of all, incredible way to make your presence felt. And yeah, it's just makes one wonder what else we can learn from them. So tell us.
Mm. I think that's it's such a fascinating site to even have the privilege to enter and to learn from. And I think the biggest takeaways in terms of my lawyering and my work with these communities has been how do we actually accommodate nature's voice in
Hmm.
a lot of the decisions we make,
Yeah.
right? In now, some legal scholars will make the argument that the reason we found ourselves in the climate crisis is because the law has silenced nature's needs and voice, both in the law but also outside the law.
Hmm.
And so, what does democracy look like if we were to accommodate the needs of a tree? And these
Hmm.
are questions. It might sound like almost like I'm writing speculative fiction or something,
Yeah.
but these are honest questions. And they've managed to design a legal system that does that. So it talks about, I mean, even if you look at just the practice of swidden farming, which was criminalized, it is one where they clear out patches of the forest, plant there, but they let that patch heal over the year, and they come
Hmm.
back to it only after a year.
Hmm.
Right? How does one work with the ecosystem? What does decision making look like if it's ecosystems determining those decisions?
Right.
And there's something there that we can learn from. And I think the second big lesson was the ability to balance economic need with respecting planetary boundaries.
Hmm.
Again, it comes back to that question of what is making a decision that looks at the lowest degree of harm on the environment without compromising basic economic necessity actually mean? And what does democracy look like in that context?
Hmm.
So one of the cases I delve quite deep into is the Niyamgiri case.
Yeah.
Just to give like a short introduction for the listeners, it was a case that a decision was made by the Supreme Court in 2013, which actually surrendered power back to the communities, the Adivasi communities, to decide whether the mine should open up or not.
Right.
And they all collectively said no in that context. And so in just going back to the festival there and actually seeing how the community talks about the law, what they would often talk about is this is what we need in order for these generations to continue to live on this hill. This doesn't make sense.
Mm.
So the ability to make that decision, how does the law operate in those decisions? And what happens? Again, not to kind of go into the extreme idea that we should always say no. That's not what I'm talking about. It's about how do we say yes, but, or no, maybe, right? Like how do those decisions, what does the decision tree there look like?
And for the people who are unfamiliar with the Niyamgiri case, it's one of the most debated and discussed cases in India. A lot happened with regards to that, and I think it was an important conceptual occurrence for your thesis, for your research overall. When you realize that the Adivasi communities are coming up with a decision-making framework, from the outside, it's very difficult to understand how do these discussions take place. Do they sit and chat? Do they debate amongst themselves? Do they vote? Uh, and is there a leader who communicates all of this? How does that actually work on the ground?
Right. So in my book, I've kind of, through an assimilation of like fieldwork across multiple parts of the country, arrived at like a decision flow that happens. So usually it starts with like what many call a betak. So it's just like a sitting down and figuring out what are the options that
Hmm.
we're dealing with. And usually every member of the community is involved in instances where there have been instances where women feel more comfortable doing these discussions on their own. So they have their own betak and there's a lot of discursive
Hmm.
conversations. Then they know that this decision has to be communicated to the formal state. So the idea then is like a sunwai or a hearing has to happen. So there's a way in which the Gram Sabha becomes, or the village assembly becomes that government, sort of that unit of governance that communicates to the formal state. And then the hope is that it transforms the decision there. Because unfortunately, till today, Adivasi sovereignty has not meant complete self-determination. It has meant it's in relation to the formal state, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's how it is. And so that's kind of how it happens. Sometimes there's a voting process depending on how formal or immediate that decision is. But
Right.
very often it's like sitting in a circle and having a long-winded conversation as a community about what do
Hmm.
we do.
Got it. Wonderful. So this case happens in terms of resistance we've learned, in terms of decision making we've learned, in terms of just really looking at the rights of a tree or looking at regenerative balance. These are things that are again like not intuitive to a person who's city bred or lives
Mm.
in, maybe a tech-enabled structure, but it seems to work for them. So
Mm.
do they need non-interference from us, or do they need more syncretic engagement? And how is the outer world really look like? Is there a way we can learn from them about trying to engage with people they don't understand?
Right. So I think those kind of boundaries of the outsider and insider do exist, but it's a lot more blurry
Hmm.
because the market surrounds them in many different ways, whether it's them selling their minor forest produce to the local seller, or it's like having the local hart or the market to sell their goods to the closest town dweller. So a lot of
Maybe
those,
e-commerce. We did some work
exactly.
when I was in Microsoft in a small tribal village in Maharashtra. And one of the things was that, can you do rural e-commerce? Can you help us sell what we do at a fair price abroad? That turned out to be an interesting way
Absolutely.
to see.
Absolutely. I think they continue to look at the quote unquote outside world as a bit of a threat because it's
Yeah.
often been present there either to extract or to disenfranchise or dispossess.
Hmm.
So I think the more interesting question is how do we have that engagement happen on fairer terms? What
Hmm.
does that look like?
Right.
How do the communities, just going back to the example that you mentioned of like, are they fairly compensated for their land. Like those are conversations I think that we should be having so that we have more, the power is more flattened in how those interactions take place.
Right. Look, the case of documentation has been a
Yeah.
challenge throughout history, whether it's the
Mm,
documentation of Jews or minorities or uh,
mm,
people from various backgrounds. They've struggled with documentation, and as many
mm,
times the lack of documentation has been used by different entities to say, "Hey, these are not your rights because you don't have ABC
exactly.
documentation." So again, thank you for bringing this to our notice. And I just want to say that this conversation is fascinating. Somebody who is in business or in tech or just wants to understand a different group of people, a different uh, set of perspectives, I think they should go ahead and engage with your book. But as we come towards the close, I always want to understand how the author's mind changed. How did she
Mm.
uh, undergo a change as a human being, as a person? How did the arguments evolve? So, how did these things take shape in your case?
Yeah, writing a book and you've written two books now. They totally they transform you in very interesting ways. I think for me the biggest transformation has been how do you not enter into these contexts with a perspective that you already understand, but rather be open to being challenged in so many ways
Mm,
that you are constantly decentered. So in my context, it goes back to some of our earlier discussion of like thinking, okay, Adivasi communities always want to protect their forests. Well, that's not really true. Then kind of saying, okay, Adivasi communities are very, highly egalitarian. That is true. But there were encounters where they were practicing discrimination against the Dalit communities who were living in those areas. How does one understand that? And I think the biggest, like, if I were to summarize what it has done to me in certain ways, is I think it's made me more open-minded, non-judgmental, and more curious. And to realize that, everything should not be a dogmatic way to see the
yeah,
world. Everything it's a kaleidoscope, really. And the richness is in seeing the world that way, because as lawyers, you're forced to pick a side. So it was like freeing to know I don't have to do that anymore.
yeah, yeah. And I feel that this is a kind of human desire these days, almost to be evangelical when you move
Mm,
to a group or almost enter with an idea that I will change the mind. I will leave this place a bit better than I left, which is, I think, all well intentioned, but
right,
sometimes you miss the point of the fact that you might need re-education yourself. So
exactly.
I think, do that really well. And I've seen you now for 13 years. In a way, you've been working on this book or this idea for 13 years. It feels like our YF discussion only 13 years wiser from your side, and my curiosity has only grown. So there are many parallels with your, academic work and mine. And I'm thinking about studying these tribes out of interest. This is not my
Mm,
dissertation, by the way. Just out of curiosity, how do these tribes communicate? How do they take decisions? How do
mm,
social networks form? How do they
right.
engage? I think somebody should do this study. It will be fascinating.
Yeah,
But you've
absolutely.
spent 13 years in a way getting multiple degrees, two masters, one PhD, I think a postdoc, and now you are a prof at Vassar. So in a book, this has been a constant, a long relationship, but a really rewarding one, I would say. How does
Yeah.
it feel? 13 years and standing.
It feels incredible. It feels incredible. But I also feel like I'm ready to now say that the book is out in the world and now I want to tell a very different story.
Yeah. And hopefully this
Yeah,
conversation was the start of you telling these stories
absolutely.
multiple times on multiple platforms. The book is available everywhere, I guess. People can order it on online platforms or pick it up
Yeah,
from the library, the store, right?
absolutely. It is everywhere. Yeah, you can find it on Amazon or any of your local bookstores.
Yeah, and make sure to leave a comment. I think that's a very helpful thing that I have found. It helps our listeners and authors find different reader groups. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't, or anything that you'd like to say to our listeners before we part for the time being?
I think the only thing I would like to say is, in whatever work that you do, I think just find ways to recenter the planetary question. Because at least among lawyers as professionals, we are going through this churn where suddenly there's like now a statement that all lawyers are climate lawyers. So how do you factor in that planetary question in your work? And you can read this book as one way to think about it, but there are so many other ways, and there are many other thinkers who offer very, very different perspectives. So yeah, just think about it. It's an important question.
What a well-deserved honor, Arpita. Thank you for writing this and for building such an incredible career.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so much pleasure to be able to talk to you about this.
See you very soon. I know you may be coming this side. I can't wait to
Yes,
catch up.
soon.